Welcome to today's lecture in the year-long series on race and regulation, organized by the Penn Program on Regulation. I'm Kerry Colanisi, the director of the Penn Program on Regulation and a professor at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. This lecture series focuses on the connection between regulations and the most important task for every society, ensuring equal justice and dignity and respect to all people. Now, a central theme in any discussion of regulation focuses on the power of the state to intervene in private affairs. And often these private affairs are thought of in terms of the open marketplace and transactions by businesses, but sometimes they are truly private and deeply personal. Few areas of the law affect people's lives so personally as the rules affecting families, and the power of the state to intervene in family life and to separate children from their parents. This power is what underlies what today's speaker has called the family regulation system. And I am extremely honored and delighted to introduce our speaker today, Professor Dorothy Roberts, who is someone who, in addition to being a remarkably generous and valued colleague, is one of the most acclaimed scholars of our time in the fields of race, gender, and the law. Professor Roberts has joint appointments at Penn. She is the George Wythe University Professor of Law and Sociology, and the Raymond Pace and Sadie Tanner Mosel Alexander Professor of Civil Rights. She is also the founding director of the Penn Program on Race, Science, and Society in the Center for Africana Studies. A prolific scholar, she is the author of numerous path-breaking books and articles on law and social justice issues, including important scholarship on policing, science, medicine, and bioethics, in addition to family regulation. She broke important new ground in the study of family regulation 20 years ago with the publication of her book, Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare. And she is here today to talk about her forthcoming book, Torn Apart: How the Child Welfare System Destroys Black Families and How Abolition Can Build a Safer World. None other than Michelle Alexander has described Torn Apart as, quote, a brilliant and impassioned call for abolition of our racist and disastrous systems of family policing. Alexander notes that Professor Roberts, quote, shows convincingly why we must reimagine child welfare and develop new systems for meeting human needs, preventing violence, and caring for children, families, and communities. And that is what we're looking forward to hearing more about today, and we'll look forward to reading when her book is released later this spring. Just a couple of brief notes before we begin. First, in addition to the Penn Program on Regulation, today's lecture is co-sponsored by the Penn Law Office of Equity and Inclusion and the Field Center for Children's Policy, Practice, and Research at Penn. Following Professor Roberts' lecture today, we will take audience questions. To ask a question, please simply click on the Q&A button down at the bottom of your browser in Zoom and type in your question, and I will try to pose as many of your questions as time permits. And now, I am exceedingly pleased and excited and honored to turn the screen over to Professor Roberts for her lecture, Black Families Matter: How the U.S. Family Regulation System Punishes Poor People of Color. Professor Roberts?
Thank you. Thanks so much, Kerry, for that introduction and for the invitation to speak in your program on regulation, and also for having this series on race and regulation at this very important time. I think it's just cool that I could speak about family regulation which is not what most people think about as the child welfare system in this series. So thank you, and thanks to everyone who's joined us today. So I'm going to share my screen. So let me begin with a story in the news from last August. At that time, a Black father named Tyrone Denier live streamed a video of armed deputies from the Manatee County Sheriff's Office surrounding his car, detaining him, his partner, Saisha Mercado, who some people knew as a former American Idol finalist, and their 10-day-old baby. The deputies had pulled the car over on the side of a highway to execute a family court judge's order to seize the couple's newborn daughter. Now, the family's nightmare began earlier in February when the parents took their 13-month-old son to a hospital in St. Petersburg, Florida, to seek medical care. Mercado was pregnant at the time, and she was trying to transition the toddler from breastfeeding to solid food. He was having trouble. She was concerned about his health, and she brought him to the hospital for help. Instead, what the hospital staff did was call the child maltreatment hotline to report that the toddler was malnourished and failing to thrive, and the Department of Children and Families took him from his parents. The video in August shows Mercado holding her baby wrapped in a pink blanket as she walks slowly from her car toward three white women who appear to be Child Protective Services agents. Mercado pauses in front of the workers and she asks them, "Do you not feel anything? You guys, I'm human. This is my baby. My baby is days old and you're taking my baby away from me. You're taking my baby away from me. You have no heart." With the help of the viral video and a team of lawyers and media attention, Mercado and Denier were reunited with their daughter 9 days later while they continued to fight to recover their son from foster care. The terror inflicted by armed officers who surrounded the family and the cruelty displayed by the CPS workers who tore an infant, a 10-day-old infant, from her loving mother's arms leave no doubt that the point of that joint incursion between police and CPS agents was to criminalize the parents, not protect the child. It's hard to think about how that baby was helped by taking it away for 9 days from her mother. What happened to Saisha Mercado's family is common and reflects key features of the so-called child welfare system. The system accuses, investigates, and blames parents disproportionately in Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities for risk to children as a subterfuge for controlling their families. It's a multi-billion-dollar state apparatus that relies on terrorizing families by taking their children away or weaponizing their children with the threat of removing them in order to impose intensive surveillance on every aspect of the family's life. And it executes this extraordinary level of state intervention and family regulation by both acting like police and working hand in hand with criminal law enforcement. The purpose of the so-called Child Protective Services is to police families. I first became aware of family policing when I was working on my 1997 book, Killing the Black Body. I'd been researching the charges brought against hundreds of Black women across the country for using crack cocaine while pregnant, and investigating how racism and the longstanding devaluation of Black mothers turned a public health issue into a crime. That's when I discovered that thousands of Black mothers were being separated from their newborns by Child Protective Services because of positive drug tests. And I realized that child removal was even more widespread and in some ways more devastating than the prosecutions I was investigating. The system's racial divide was obvious to me as soon as I started observing child welfare proceedings in Chicago, where virtually every single family hauled before the court was Black. If you came as with no preconceptions about the purpose of the child welfare system and you sat in court, you would have to conclude that it's an institution designed to monitor, regulate, and punish poor families of color. As I began to spend time with Black mothers whose children had been taken from them, I learned about the devastating harms the system inflicts on Black children, families, and communities. So I wrote a book about the targeting of Black families for destruction called Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare, which was published in 2001. And I became extremely involved in numerous reform efforts launched by child welfare departments, foundations, and organizations to close the racial gap, what was coming to be known as racial disproportionality. I even served for 9 years on a task force dedicated to fixing violations of foster children's constitutional rights by the state of Washington. 20 years later, Black and Native communities are still targeted for child welfare investigations. Although the racial disparities in foster care are less glaring than they were in the 1990s, Black and Native children remain overrepresented in foster care populations. More telling are recent data indicating children's chances of landing in foster care at some point while growing up. In other words, not just one point in time, but their chances over their entire childhoods. According to a 2014 study, about 15% of Native children and 12% of Black children can expect to enter foster care before their 18th birthday. That's an extremely high rate of the state taking children away from their homes and putting them in substitute care in state custody. The rate for white children, about 1 in 20, is also remarkably high. Even though it's lower, it's alarming that so many white children also are taken from their homes. In many cities, child welfare agency involvement is concentrated in segregated and impoverished Black neighborhoods. So every child residing there, whether they're taken or not, lives with a realistic fear that state agents may come to their home and snatch them away from their parents. This, to me, is one of the main differences between the meaning of the child welfare system for Black children and white children in America. Most Black children know about the child welfare system and fear that it can come and interrupt their families' lives. That's not true for most white children in America. I call that the racial geography of child welfare. Last year, I contemplated publishing a 20th anniversary edition of Shattered Bonds with a new preface updating these statistics, but my preface turned into a new book. Torn Apart: How the Child Welfare System Destroys Black Families and How Abolition Can Build a Safer World will be released by Basic Books next April. And you can pre-order it now if you'd like to. Maybe you'll be interested by the end of my talk today. In Torn Apart, I renew my call to abolish the family policing system. And I did use those words in Shattered Bonds, that the system should be abolished. This time, however, I don't argue for replacing it with another reformed state system. I'm now convinced that we need to completely dismantle the child welfare system while we build a radically reimagined way of caring for families and keeping children safe. To understand why, it helps to look back at the roots that still structure the system we have today. The origins of the US child welfare system lie in oppression of marginalized people by powerful white elites. The ideology of violent supervision of Black families by white people can be traced to the forcible separation of enslaved families, where, of course, under slavery, Black people were deemed the legal property of enslavers, and the enslavers had the absolute right to separate families at any time they wanted to, and they did. And then after the Civil War, Black children were routinely returned to enslavers to work for them as apprentices by family courts. And if you look at some of the laws that allowed that, they sound very much like neglect laws on the books today. The mass removal of Indigenous children to be placed in boarding schools was an instrument of tribal genocide. It was a war tactic that the US government developed as part of its military strategy to decimate Native peoples. And then following that was the US government's adoption policy that deliberately took Native children from their tribes to be adopted into white homes. For white children, placing European immigrants from impoverished cities was part of the origin of foster care. The first foster homes were where charities sent European immigrant children to work in those homes. And in fact, there is this myth that the child welfare system began to protect a little girl from abuse by her parents, and that was actually abuse by a foster family where the girl was placed because she was poor. Later, white children were put on orphan trains and sent to distant locations to work on farms. So the whole point of the child welfare system has always been to regulate economically and racially marginalized communities. Their subordinated status makes them vulnerable to state intervention because of the way that child maltreatment is defined to blame them for harms to children that are caused by societal inequities. The definition of neglect is easily conflated with poverty. In fact, in some places, it's basically a definition of poverty. And so the very meaning of child maltreatment is framed as a way to blame parents for the harms of societal inequities that cause children to be raised in poverty. Family policing helps then to keep these communities in their subordinated status by disrupting their family and social relationships and interfering with their communities. And more broadly, family policing implements an approach to child welfare that buttresses an unequal social structure by attributing the horrible consequences of these inequities to the supposed parental pathologies of the family and pretending that Child Protective Services is addressing the problems through therapeutic remedies. For most of the system's history, Black children's needs were completely ignored by the charities that were developing in the 1800s and early 1900s. It wasn't until the civil rights movement when Black people demanded extension of government welfare entitlements that white people had been receiving to Black communities. And then public agencies pivoted sharply from providing services to children in their homes, white children in their homes, to taking children from their parents. We can clearly see the collusion and convergence of the skyrocketing of foster care with the skyrocketing of Black families in the child welfare system, propelling the spike in foster care and also in federal funding for foster care, so that today the vast majority of federal funds to the child welfare system go to maintaining children outside their homes. And that was linked to the massive removal of Black children from their homes. Given its oppressive foundations, it should come as no surprise that the child welfare system is structured to cause devastating injuries to the children it separates from their families. On top of inflicting trauma of separating children from their loved ones, state agencies fail to ensure that children in their custody receive the care they need and subject many of them to sexual and physical abuse. Many children are shuffled to multiple placements, including congregate settings that aren't fit for children. And so the system is set up to interfere with their emotional and physical health, their education, and their social relationships. It forces many children into poverty, homelessness, and prisons. We've known this for a long time, the connection between imprisonment, being unhoused, being unemployed, having PTSD, et cetera, with placement in foster care. Many children try to escape foster care by running away, either back to their families, and often that's where they're running, or just to surviving in the streets. They would rather survive in the street than be put back into foster care. And even more tragically, many escape by taking their own lives. There's an extremely high rate of suicide among even little children in foster care. There's also a thin line between the state's treatment of Black children in foster care and its treatment of those in juvenile detention. In fact, the state often confines Black children who are adjudicated dependent and those who are adjudicated delinquent in exactly the same horrific and sometimes deadly institutions where no child should have to suffer. Foster care criminalizes Black children. And I'll just give two horrible examples of this from recent years. David Hess, who was killed by guards in the Wordsworth Academy. They all have these euphemistic names to make them sound like they're good places for children. And they're called generally therapeutic treatment facilities. David Hess was killed when he was accused of hiding an iPhone in his room. And Cornelius Fredericks in Kalamazoo, Michigan, in Lakeside Academy, killed because he threw a piece of bread in the cafeteria there. And these are just some examples of the way in which Black children are treated in these centers. One of the child welfare system's chief functions is to keep an eye on families in Black communities. Family surveillance extends far beyond the numbers of children placed in foster care, the measure most commonly noted to gauge the system's scope and impact. CPS agencies investigate the families of 3.5 million children every year. More than half of Black children will be subject to investigation at some point before they reach age 18. And let me repeat that, more than half of Black children will be subjected to an investigation before they reach the age 18. And I say subjected to because many of these children are forced to strip for strangers. Their private information is taken. They are removed sometimes from their families as a result, but even if they're not, the investigation itself is a traumatizing experience. Oh, and let me just say a couple words about what's on the screen now. One is an image of child welfare investigators in an office in Arizona where they thought it was funny to make and wear t-shirts with the name professional kidnappers around across their chests. And I say in Torn Apart that, of course, there's always a kernel of truth in any joke. And they were at least being honest about the work that they do. The other is a poster that was created by JMAC for Families, led by the wonderful Joyce McMillan in Harlem. They separate children at the border of Harlem too, to point out that the outrage, a deserved outrage of President Trump and other presidents' policies of taking children, the migrant children from their families, all happens in Black neighborhoods every single day. As states around the country began to reduce their foster care populations in recent decades, they simultaneously expanded their invasion into the private lives of families by investigating them and overseeing them with coercive services. Identifying children at risk for abuse or neglect gives caseworkers the authority to probe into and regulate every aspect of their family's life. And it doesn't diminish the state's power to tear families apart. Family regulation still relies on this ever-present threat to take away children, and child welfare authorities still make good on that threat far too often. To assist in surveilling families, child welfare departments enlist the eyes and ears of deputized agents. Under federal law, every state must identify mandated reporters, people who work in professions that put them in contact with children, such as teachers, healthcare providers, social services staff, and daycare workers, and require them under certain circumstances to report suspected child abuse and neglect to government authorities. Family policing relies on this expansive network of information sharing that spans the school, healthcare, public assistance, and law enforcement systems. This confluence of social services and child protective services directs state surveillance against poor and low-income families, especially Black families who are more likely to rely on public service providers. Using social services, receiving welfare benefits, and living in public housing subject families to an extra layer of contact with mandated reporters. Public professionals are far more likely to report maltreatment than are private professionals who serve a more affluent paying clientele. And this is part of the reason why the vast majority of children in foster care or just investigated even by CPS are poor, because wealthy families don't get reported. It's not because they're not doing the same things that impoverished parents might be doing that the impoverished parents get blamed for as child neglect. It's mainly because they're not meant for this system. So the system doesn't bother to investigate them. And mandated reporters don't report them the way that they easily report impoverished parents, especially if they're parents of color. The racial disparities in mandated reporting show that reporters don't really think they're required to report abuse and neglect in every case. They serve as agents of a system designed to regulate marginalized families only. CPS then treats these reports like accusations to be investigated, not requests for help. So parents risk losing their children every time they interact with teachers, doctors, and welfare staff who double as surveillance agents for the state. Mandated reporting, therefore, drives many family caregivers from the very people who are most likely to support them. It deters families from seeking needed assistance and weakens service providers' capacity to improve children's welfare. Providing services within a punitive family policing system thwarts the potential for schools, healthcare clinics, and social programs to be caring hubs of community engagement that non-coercively help families meet their material needs. Now, most people think of the child welfare system and the criminal punishment system as distinct parts of government. Child welfare is supposed to be based on civil law and therefore not entail the surveillance, punishment, and condemnation that characterize criminal law enforcement. In reality, though, the family policing system operates surprisingly like its criminal counterpart. It investigates, accuses, prosecutes, and supervises families just like police, prosecutors, criminal courts, and parole officers. The child welfare system not only resembles the criminal punishment system, it also operates in tight conjunction with police and prisons. And we see a task force. This is increasingly common task force of police officers and child protective services agents. This is somehow supposed to make the police kinder and gentler, but what it does is make child welfare investigations more brutal and prone to violence and even deaths of parents when their homes are invaded by police officers. And I give examples of those in my book. I don't have time to talk about all the ways that Black parents have been assaulted during child welfare investigations. And also another shout out to JMAC for families and the billboard, some cops are called caseworkers. So the more you consider all the ways the child welfare system parallels and intersects with the criminal punishment system, the more it looks like one integrated state apparatus for controlling Black communities. It's a giant carceral web. Comparing the powers of child welfare workers and police officers reveals a disturbing paradox. Child welfare authorities can wield greater control over families than cops while providing fewer legal protections to parents and children. Child welfare investigations are the stop and frisk of family surveillance without the safeguards of law and public scrutiny that we expect in a criminal context. In fact, child protection serves the purpose of allowing the state to manage members of oppressed communities without having to go through the trouble of convicting them in criminal court for crimes. The rhetoric of saving children is merely a guise to justify expanding the government's power to investigate and regulate these communities beyond what we would permit by criminal justice. Compared with police stops and arrests, child protection investigations dig far deeper into the private lives of suspects. Caseworkers can make multiple unannounced home visits at any time, at day or night, interrogate all household members, force children to disrobe, do criminal background checks, and request personal information from teachers, hospitals, therapists, and other service providers. In some cities, caseworkers force parents to sign blank releases to obtain their and their children's confidential records. The state's vast family surveillance apparatus that I just described, made up of caseworkers, police officers, and mandated reporters, has been expanding even more to startling levels now that state CPS authorities are employing big databases, computer programming, and artificial intelligence to monitor families and make automated decisions about intervening in them. Some of the nation's largest child welfare departments in California, Florida, Illinois, Pennsylvania, and Texas are using computerized risk assessment technologies to magnify family surveillance. This is another parallel between the child welfare system and the criminal punishment system, with child welfare agencies following digital models that are implemented by police to identify so-called hotspots where police focus their surveillance and intervention. Of course, those hotspots tend to be in Black neighborhoods, the same neighborhoods where we see concentrations of child welfare agency involvement. One of the chief players in the child welfare analytics is SAS. And I just want to read a little bit from its website to give you an idea of the vast scope of this surveillance that is now being targeted at families. SAS is the world's largest software company, and on its website, it claims the capacity to, quote, access child-related data no matter where it is stored. The sources for such data, it says, include social benefits, education, healthcare, law enforcement, criminal justice systems, etc. The company boasts of, quote, a hybrid analytical approach that applies, quote, business rules, anomaly detection, predictive modeling, social network analysis, geospatial analysis, etc., to calculate child safety risk scoring. And its surveillance tools dig deep into the lives not only of families that are that might be suspected of child abuse, but also anyone related or in their social networks to, quote, capture important data about them, criminal histories, behavioral health data, drug or alcohol treatment data, etc. And then all this goes into an automated system where, quote, risk scores are continuously recalculated based on the most up-to-date information, and an alert engine proactively notifies caseworkers when risk thresholds are exceeded. Now, all of the algorithms that go into calculating when the alarm should go off to send caseworkers into people's homes is a black box. The mathematical formulas are proprietary trade secrets and safeguarded from disclosure by intellectual property law. So government agencies and the public have no idea how these risk scores are calculated. And like predictive policing, these models import into the database and the algorithms biases against poor families and families of color. Of course, this creates a feedback loop. Once you're predicted to be a risky family, that now you're under investigation, really intense investigation, which increases the chances that a caseworker is going to find something wrong in the family, and then that proves to county officials that the prediction was accurate. But in fact, studies of predictive models in Los Angeles and Chicago reveal tremendous numbers of false positives, children predicted to be abused by the algorithm who weren't. But that's not the main problem. Accuracy isn't the main problem. The main problem is that these mathematical models are used to statistically identify targets of investigation within these giant databases, detached from any regard to whether these families have actually harmed their children. Okay, let me close with what we need to do about this. I want to leave time for Q&A. Given the foundational logic, the way these systems operate, centered on threatening politically marginalized families with child removal, the system has absorbed decades and decades, and in fact, centuries of attempts to reform it. What comes out of these reforms is a continuation of the basic way the system operates, because it was intended, it was designed to operate this way. And so what we need is a total paradigm shift in the state's relationship to families, a complete end to family policing by dismantling the current system and reimagining the very meaning of child welfare and safety. We're seeing an uprising of radical organizing by system-involved parents to end family policing, with Black mothers at the forefront. People, including youth who've experienced foster care and others involved in family policing, are calling for transformative change across the nation. And their calls for abolition are beginning to garner support from scholars, foundations, policy centers, and activist organizations. They're working to end mandated reporting, to give parents high quality, multidisciplinary legal defense at every stage of the process, including before children are removed, to fund and engage in community-based mutual aid, and to put income and other needed resources directly in the hands of family caregivers. So we need a common mission with other abolitionist struggles that are going on across the nation to bring down all the extensions of a carceral state. And we need a common vision for meeting human needs, preventing violence, and caring for children, families, and communities. And a first step that I hope to accomplish in my book, Torn Apart, is to help people understand that the child welfare system is a system designed to police families, not to protect children. Thank you. And I'll stop.
Thank you very much, Professor Roberts. You've given us a lot. There's still a lot more to come in the book, so we're glad we can pre-order it right now.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you for allowing us some time for questions. Let me start with a question about whether you see the racism underlying the oppression in the child welfare system is a function of how the current rules are implemented versus the content or the design of those rules. And there's a question that came up in the Q&A, and I would invite anybody in the audience, if you have a question, to put it in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. The question that came up there is from someone who is a social worker or training to be a social worker, wondering if there's something about that profession that needs to be reformed, or are the social workers themselves sort of trapped in a structure that leads to the outcomes you've described?
Yeah, so it's mostly the way, and fundamentally, the way the system is designed and structured. Again, it is structured around investigating, accusing, surveilling, punishing, tearing children away from their families. That is the essence of the system. It requires the threat to remove children in order to supervise the families. That's how they get families to cooperate, often without judges being involved. That's something else I talk about in the book, a whole shadow system where caseworkers threaten to take children away or to go to court if the family doesn't abide by rules that the caseworker has made up. So that coercive aspect of it is the way it's structured. Now, what does racism have to do with it? Well, it's not just a matter of bias, or even mostly a matter of bias on the part of people working in the system. It's that people are working in a system that is structured and designed and whose purpose is to regulate Black families. It functions in a racist way. That doesn't mean that everybody working in the system has racist intentions. Some do, but they are working in a system that was designed to implement a racial capitalist approach to inequality. It's not just an approach to families. The approach to families results from what will support a society that is structured and rooted in inequality, and to prevent the changes we would need to have a more equal society. Now, what do you do if you are a social worker? Well, there are calls around the country for social work to go back to some of its original principles. There is an ethical code of social workers, which would actually prevent, if they followed it, some of the actions that they're taking. But number one, even if you have the best of intentions, you're working in a system that is not designed to provide the concrete material resources that families need. It's designed to put parents into therapeutic services based on this false idea that the problems their children have are because of parental pathologies. So what social workers can do is work to dismantle the system. Number one, they don't have to work within the system. There are family defender offices around the country that work in teams with social workers to defend families and keep children from being put in foster care. I would also highly recommend finding organizations of social workers who are advocating for putting together programs, thinking through how to be an anti-racist social worker and work to transform the way in which social workers are now captured in a system that is causing more harm than good.
So the system, by the way it's set up, it seems very clearly is much more comfortable funding foster care, paying foster parents, supporting this, what you said, billion-dollar industry.
Yeah.
Maybe more than actually providing resources and support directly to parents who are facing poverty and to redistributing wealth. So yeah. Why is that? Why is it that that's the way we as a society have gone down that path?
Right. Well, we could ask that question about why have we gone down that path with healthcare? Why have we gone down that path with college education? Why have we gone down that path with incarceration? All of these, the lack of a universal healthcare, the lack of universal college education, the lack of adequate housing for everybody, and so all of that, you have to look at it in conjunction with the carceral approaches we have to meeting needs, putting people in jail and prisons, putting children in foster care, these ways of coercive, punitive ways of meeting the needs of people who are disadvantaged and excluded and harmed by an unequal social structure. And so why do we do it this way is because of the investment that the most powerful people have in keeping these unequal social structures. But there is a more and more and more of criticism of the way our society is structured, more people rising up to say we want change, even saying we need to abolish prisons, for example, more people interested in understanding or at least curious about that. And that's what has to be done, dismantling these structures that hold up the inequality while we, and this is really important, a point I make in the book, and I only got to it at the end of my lecture, but just as important is we have to be creating what would actually support families, what would actually keep children safe. And these are community-based, both community-based ways of meeting families' concrete needs. But I'm someone who says we also need federal policy and state policy that does that. So an example is the policies of what are called, child tax credits. They're actually checks made out to families outside the child welfare system, without strings attached. Families can do whatever they want with this money to help them raise their children. That right now, the question is, when is it going to end? Because people can't imagine that would be government policy in the United States. But we know, we actually have some evidence that it is because of those checks and mutual aid in New York City was the reason why, even when the child welfare system basically shut down in New York City during the lockdown, there wasn't a rise in child abuse. In fact, some have said that there was a decrease in child abuse and neglect because there was a better policy implemented in New York City during that time. So there was all this alarm, oh, children are going to be stuck at home and their parents are going to be abusing them, and we won't have caseworkers investigating. But it turns out that that didn't happen at all. What happened was mutual aid organizations sprang into action and provided the resources that families needed, and families were getting checks in the mail or in their bank accounts to help them take care of their children. And we have evidence that this works better than policing families to keep children safe and thriving.
Is this at all, do you think, a blue state, red state problem? Are the so-called liberal or progressive cities, you mentioned New York, I mean, are they doing better compared to others?
I haven't done an analysis of red state, blue state. I can say that generally blue states have better overall policies for supporting families than red states, but that doesn't necessarily mean that their child welfare policies are better when it comes to the child welfare system. So you still have in blue states, like New York, I think New York is still blue, it's hard to know, they're shifting, but you still have child welfare systems that are focused on either taking children away or threatening to take them away. High rates of racial disparities. New York City has a high rate of racial disparities. It also has segregated Black neighborhoods. Chicago, for example, very racially segregated, and that maps onto the racial disparities in the child welfare system, which is one of the reasons why I'm very adamant in saying these big social spending policies or social welfare policies are good. It's better to put money in the hands of families than rely on taking their children away and giving benefits to the substitute caregivers. But we also have to make these anti-racist policies, because you could still, if there are communities that are targeted, they can still be targeted even if we have better social welfare policies. We need to pay attention to both. We need a stronger set of universal policies that provide resources that families need, but we also have to tackle the anti-Black racism in the systems, in so many systems in the United States today.
One questioner was very struck, as I think we all were, about the examples you gave of children who were killed in custody, and wondered if you could say a word or two about either those specific cases or in general, how are these institutions themselves regulated, and what are the accountability metrics or measures that are in place when children are harmed within those institutional settings?
Yeah, it's one of the most shocking things I discovered as well doing research for Torn Apart. Wordsworth Academy, for example, where the 16-year-old was killed because he was accused of harboring an iPhone in his room. And very often in these cases, guards and a number of guards jump on top of children and asphyxiate them. In the case of Cornelius Fredericks, a number of guards jumped on him. He was screaming, "I can't breathe," and he was killed. Now, in that case, in Kalamazoo, Michigan, Lakeside Academy was shut down after the death. So was Wordsworth Academy in Philadelphia after the death. But in both places, there was evidence that this kind of brutality had been going on. In fact, in Cornelius Frederick's case, when they investigated, they found a video of him being restrained in the same way earlier, not that long before he was killed. And in the Wordsworth Academy, there were 800 calls to the police from that academy recently, and many involving claims of sexual abuse within the academy. So the authorities knew this was going on. In California, children were being shipped off to places like Lakeside Academy from California when they entered foster care, or sometimes after they've been moved lots of times. Very often teens get placed in these congregate facilities after they've been moved, and the authorities say, well, we can't find any place for them. Sometimes they're put directly in these settings. And after some of these deaths, California had to take all these kids back who were spread around the country, and they did pass a law stopping the transfer of children to out-of-state facilities, because this is one of the problems when children are in out-of-state facilities, but they're supposedly under the care of a different state. It's hard to monitor what's happening to them. And there are really just horrific things that happen to children in these facilities. As I mentioned, very often children who've been adjudicated as juvenile delinquents and those adjudicated as dependents in foster care are put together. None of them should be treated this way, but and they're disproportionately Black children, Black teenagers who are put in here. And also, let me mention one other thing. One of the reasons why they get put in these so-called therapeutic facilities is because their parents can't afford the care. Some of these children do have mental health problems or behavioral problems. And the child welfare authorities say to them, you have to give up custody of your children in order to get care. They can't afford it. And then the children sometimes are shipped off to another state, never to see their families again. It's just a horrible, horrible state of affairs. I recommend a report called Think About Us that was recently published by a group, and its name is escaping me now. Maybe someone will put it in the chat, but of former foster youth who interviewed children who had been placed in institutional settings like this. And the stories are really just totally heartbreaking.
You mentioned that sometimes children who might have some disabilities or mental health issues may need additional care, and that is because their families are not able to afford that care. That's one pathway. What about parents with disabilities? I mean, you mentioned race and class here as being significant determinants of this system as we have. Is there a role for disability as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something I write about in Torn Apart. I should have mentioned it, but disability and discrimination against parents with disabilities plays in this as well. If we think about drug problems as a disability, many, probably a majority of cases involve drugs in some way. Now, in many cases, drug use is equated with unfitness as a parent when it isn't. And of course, this applies mostly to Black and impoverished families. We know that, wealthy parents use drugs and their kids don't. There's no fear at all that their kids are going to be taken from them. But this is grounds for removing children. But in some cases, it is a health problem. And instead of treating it as such, children are routinely taken from their parents for that. There are also other kinds of mental disabilities that parents have, or physical disabilities that are treated as if they make parents unfit. And I talk about a class action lawsuit in Massachusetts that helped to change those rules, where disabilities were routinely being seen as evidence of unfitness without actually looking at the capacity of parents to take care of their children. So disability is a big aspect of this as well. Also, I did mention that in general, the idea that the reason why children are neglected and abused is because of parental pathology and the routine use of therapeutic care treatment, the so-called, this is forced treatment, so-called treatment by therapists, is another way in which disability plays into this, because there's the system assumes that the reason why parents are unfit is because they have some mental disability. So even embedded in the system is this assumption that that mental incapacity, is related to parental unfitness, actually is the core of parental unfitness, which also leads to discrimination against people with mental or cognitive disabilities, but also discrimination against Black parents who are often perceived to have a cognitive disability even when they don't. So it's entwined in all of these ways in the very logic and ideology of the child welfare system.
Well, we have lots of questions that we're not going to have time for. The weight of the responses, by the way, on the report you mentioned. The report is called "Away from Home," with the organization Think of Us, led by Sixto Cancel.
Thank you. Thank you. I knew somebody would put that.
Yeah, we have plenty of responses. My thanks to all of those who gave those answers, and all of you who have offered questions we're not able to get to. I apologize. I want to close with one last question, if I may, Professor Roberts. Sure. Can you leave us with one or two action items, something that each of us could do that would be positive and move in a good direction?
Sure. So one thing I would say is become familiar with some of the organizations that are working to abolish the system and replace it with a truly caring approach to families that actually meets family and children's needs and actually prevents violence instead of just reacting to it. And so some of those I mentioned: JMAC for Families, led by Joyce McMillan. Movement for Family Power is another. The Upend movement is another. You can find all of they all have websites. JMAC for Families has a legislative action program where they are. This is mostly in New York, but it can be replicated in other places. Ending mandated reporting, giving legal representation to parents, notifying parents of their rights from the very beginning of the system, the interaction with the system. You can, the law students here can look into Family Defender Services. Kara Fink, who runs our child advocacy clinic here at Penn Law, is a former family defense attorney and knows a lot about this, has many connections as well. Community Legal Services and Kathleen Creamer here in Philadelphia. But around the country, there are family defender services that are providing multidisciplinary defense representation for families. Learn more about this so that when you encounter people who are talking about stories in the news, you can explain the way that this system operates, not as a true protector of children and support for children, but as a way of policing families. And think about ways that you in your communities can help each other to care for children. Many communities have some form of mutual aid where you can reach out to struggling families, and instead of turning them over to, to have the families, the children separated, you can figure out in the community ways of supporting each other. So those are just some ways of not only dismantling the system through legislation, through protest, but also, just as importantly, building the society that we would want for our families, and making sure that we all equally can raise our families. There's no group that is unloving and doesn't care about its children. Those are horrible racist stereotypes. How can we help children throughout our society thrive? And that's really, as we imagine that, we will no longer need to have intervention into families to take children away to keep them safe. That's what we want to have, a society where we couldn't imagine that would make any sense to do that, to protect a child. What happened to Saisha Mercado, ripping her 10-day-old baby from her, that would be absurd. Why would you ever do that? That's what we want, where that would be unimaginable, because we have such a wonderful way of caring for each other.
Caring for each other is a great way to end this talk, but also knowing that we've all started our own path forward by listening to your remarks here today. And we thank you so much for helping illuminating such an important aspect of our society and the interaction between government and people's lives. And I hope that that we all will go out and buy your book and continue to keep apprised of all of these issues and take action to make the world a more just and equal place. So thank you very much for your time today, Professor Roberts. If we were all gathered in one place in person, I know we would be giving you a rousing round of applause right now, with a standing room only kind of crowd that we've had here today. So thank you very much, and good evening. Thank you to all who've attended, and we wish you the best.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Thanks everybody out there for listening.